Hello everyone, my name is Sean Solomon and welcome to my Sumo Logic Illuminate segment where we're going to be talking about automating insider threat monitoring and how Sumo Logic plays a critical role in this workflow. Now, a little bit about myself. I've only really been in the cybersecurity industry for about a year and a half, most of that time with Netskope. I started as an intern back in September and got converted full-time as an information security analyst once I graduated college in May. Now, one of my first tasks as an information security analyst full-time was helping with user monitoring requests, where we assess the risk that a user poses as a potential insider threat. Now, I, of course, brought out our standard operating procedure, and after taking a look at it, I thought, yeah, I'm pretty sure that I can automate this entire process. And so I did. Now, some of you may actually believe that automation is just for the lazy and the people who don't want to do a whole lot of work. But there is a real business value to operationalizing automated processes. The Teema India CEO, Haresh Sippy, once said, "Automation is cost-cutting by tightening the corners and not cutting them." And I think this is the way that we need to view automation going forward. According to the Poneman Institute, an insider threat incident can cost a company an average of $15 million. And that's just not money that teams and companies are going to want to be losing potentially consistently. It's just not good business. And I'm probably stressing a lot of you out by even bringing that up, but imagine that you are the analyst that has to deal with that incident, or you're the manager of the analyst that has to handle that incident, and they make a mistake that costs you $15 million. It's not a very pleasant thing to think about. But once we built out this process, this automated procedure, and we have a machine doing all the work, we can make sure that we're lowering our risk of human errors and making our processes more effective and more efficient. Now, there are additional logistical concerns that we have to keep in mind when handling these types of incidents. For example, our standard operating procedure involved at least 5 different people, at least 10 different tools, at least 90 minutes of human work time. That's just a lot of resources that a SOC cannot always be able to provide. What if the request comes in on a weekend or an overnight shift where you just generally have less coverage? What if the one analyst who is working on this is not super familiar with the SOP for this investigation, or doesn't have the experience to make the decisions on their own? These are the types of cases and situations that we often find ourselves in, and that we have to account for when developing our standard operating procedures, and likewise thinking about bringing automation into the picture. Now, with all of these people, once they eventually do come online, we want to make sure that we can value their time and that all the information that they need to make quick and effective decisions is available to them the second that they log in. Now, this is a disaster right here. What if your analyst that's handling your standard operating procedure has tabs that look like this? Incredibly unorganized, and personally, I'm not sure that I can trust the analyst with these types of tabs to not accidentally overlook an important bit of information, to miss a step in the operating procedure. And even if their windows looked pristine, they looked gorgeous, there's always going to be that risk that they could accidentally look over something. After all, we are humans, and humans make mistakes. So now that we've done gone over a lot of these considerations, how do we build a process that can actually address all of these concerns, all of these questions, and more that have to be posed? Well, we start off with Slack. We have a custom workflow step and a modal available so that whoever receives a request can type in some very basic information and then send that off to Tines, our SOAR platform. Tines handles all of the logic for us and ultimately handles all of the API calls that we're going to be making to Sumo Logic. So instead of having the analyst who has a dozen or so or more tabs open and having to access 10 to a dozen or more different tools, we can just have Tines, a machine, access Sumo Logic, which then reaches out and searches through logs for all of the different tools that we might use during an investigation. It can gather logs from our EDR and check to see what IP addresses the user has been over the past 30, 60 days or so. We can look in our cloud storage solutions to see if there's any evidence of data exfiltration or any files being shared outside of the organization. We can even look through our marketing and our sales tools to make sure that critical customer data or potential leads are not going directly to our competitors as users leave the organization. Now, there's several different parts to the Sumo Logic API that we use as part of this workflow. For those of you who have worked with it before, you know that there's several different subtypes, and overall Sumo's API is pretty comprehensive, but the three main ones that we use are folder management, search jobs, and content management. Now, the way that we use folder management might look a little bit complicated, and it's the biggest chunk that I'll show you today, but it's really not all that glamorous. Really what this part does is make sure that we have folders created in Sumo to have a current year folder and a current month folder. So we make sure that we have an August or September month folder within our year 2022 folder. It just helps us keep organized, keep Sumo nice and clean. We don't have 100 different investigations all in the same folder, and it takes a while to find out which one you're actually looking for. You can narrow it down by year and month to make sure that you can get and access this information quicker. So it looks like a lot, but it's really not. But the core of this workflow it starts here. It starts with the content management API. During our investigations, we may not find any historical activity that we would deem to be malicious. But as users are potentially still undergoing offboarding and planning on leaving the organization, there is always that potential for the actor to, in the future, act against your organization, act against your best interest. And so we set up these alerts using the content management API to detect mass downloads or data exfiltration. See if if they're sharing data externally with a personal address or with an address of a competitor. We want to make sure that we catch these things early so that we can address them as quickly as possible and limit the impact of a potential insider threat. Moving on to our search jobs API. This one is somewhere in the middle in terms of how complicated it looks. But what essentially this workflow does is it checks whether the user has transferred any data to an external USB drive, which is a very common way of data exfiltration. So we set up a search job in the Sumo Logic API, and we set a loop so that it checks itself every 5 seconds. Really, you can adjust it to up to 20 seconds if you want to, but I prefer 5. So it loops through for as long as the job is not complete. And once the requests see that the job is actually complete and it's got all the data we need, then we make sure that we capture all the messages, all the logs that were captured in that search. And we can also capture the records as well to get aggregates of data, which might be a bit more consumable to not only the analysts, but also the people who ultimately make decisions on escalation. So the entire workflow is some 200, 300 actions long right now, but it's way too big to fit into a picture or to go through all of it today. But ultimately what it accomplishes is the report that you see on the right-hand side. an information gathering report that gives a snippet of some of the information that we gather on our users to give our analysts and decision makers everything that they need. Obviously, the actual report is a little bit bigger, but you get the idea that we have insight into what security tools the user has on their device. What device do they have in the first place? Do they potentially have multiple devices? What is some of their basic activity look like that might immediately red flag them as an insider threat? All that information gathered by only 0 people, 1 machine, 0 tabs, 1 machine. And they only had to access 1 tool to be able to gather all of that information, Sumo Logic. And that's where Sumo has been great for us, because we don't have to connect and share credentials or pass credentials to a bunch of different API endpoints or a bunch of different tools. We can send everything through Sumo and get all the critical information that we need in a nice, compact, organized manner. But this workflow is still evolving continuously. We want to expand our logging capabilities. And as we ingest new log sources or new subsections of log sources, we're constantly asking ourselves, is this data relevant to a potential insider threat investigation? Would this data be nice to have or useful to have? We can add it. On the flip side, we refine the searches that we currently have. Is some information that we are gathering not actually that helpful, or is it throwing us off a little bit? Well, we can remove that. What if we're not searching long enough, or we're searching for too long of a time period? We can refine that. All of these searches are very easy to tweak within the Sumo Logic API and within Tines. And it gives us a lot of flexibility, especially when you start analyzing baselines across different departments, and one search that you have going for your HR team is just not going to work when you start talking about your product engineering teams. So this workflow gives us flexibility in that regard as well. And additionally, we want to make sure that we're cleaning up these investigations and retaining this data long term. We send all of this data to our cloud storage solution, and we manage the access to it to make sure that the analysts and the decision makers that absolutely need access to it and have the ability to escalate to potentially HR or to legal if they request information, those are the only people that we want accessing this data. And cleaning it up is great because it also keeps our tools nice and tidy. Sumo Logic doesn't need 100 different folders within one subfolder. We can delete some of these searches and alerts as the investigations are done, but record the information with Tines and ultimately send it to our long-term storage solution. So the entire standard operating procedure for Netskope's insider threat monitoring has been completely automated. We still have to add the human touch, but that takes far less time and far less effort than having to go through picking through all these data sources. And it cuts down our response time significantly. It reduces the chance of human errors and ensures that we can make efficient and effective decisions. The process, it doesn't cut any corners. In fact, you might actually say that it allows us to add more corners. But when it helps us to catch an insider threat before they can do major damage to the company, then ultimately we're cutting costs as well. Thank you.